So this afternoon, Professor Jane Fountain of the Department of Political Science and the Center for Public Policy and Administration will present her lecture entitled Technological Change as a Variable in State Development. Professor Fountain's talk will consider the role of the internet and social media technologies play in transforming democracies and, I presume, other forms of government around the world. These developments, as she'll discuss, have produced unforeseen outcomes that have been both positive and negative. In preparing for this talk today, I learned that Professor Fountain did not start her academic career in political science and public policy, but rather she began at the Boston Conservatory of Music, where she was a violinist and served as concertmaster. However, her move from music to political science is not an entirely unlikely leap. As a student of music, Fountain was particularly interested in the analysis of music's underlying structures. Further, she observes that algorithmic composition and heated resistance to it as art or expression or creativity are analogous to the highly pitched debates in social and other sciences about the role of underlying rule systems in human and social behavior. After graduation, Professor Fountain considered graduate study in music theory and musicology, but instead decided on a course of study that would focus on contemporary social and policy challenges and which led to the social sciences. Nonetheless, her long-standing interest in the roles of structure, rule systems, and architecture still prevail, no matter what her field of study. Professor Fountain has been an active member of the campus community since 2005. She holds joint appointments in both the Department of Political Science and the Center for Public Policy and Administration, and is also an adjunct professor in the Department of Computer Science. In addition, Professor Fountain is director of the National Center for Digital Government and the director of the Science, Technology, and Society Initiative. The distinctions Professor Fountain has received as a member of our faculty clearly demonstrate her dedication to the UMass Amherst campus. These include the 2010 Chancellor's Award for Outstanding Accomplishments in Research and Creative Activity, one of our highest honors for research. Nationally, the American Political Science Association has recognized Professor Fountain as an inaugural senior fellow. She's also chaired the World Economic Forum, and she currently sits on the Governor's Council of Innovation Advisors. And we are delighted that she is here to speak with us today. It's now my pleasure to invite Lee Badgett, Director of the Center for Public Policy Administration, to continue this introduction of our distinguished.
Thank you, Provost Staros. You're going to get 3 for the price of 1 today. So I want to just say it's really a pleasure and an honor to introduce my friend and colleague, Jane Fountain. And it's great that she's here to talk to us here at UMass. We see her flying here and there in the last couple of years. She's given keynotes and big conferences and before leaders of Singapore, Portugal, the United Kingdom, Turkey, Korea, Sweden. She always seems to be on a plane, so I'm very grateful to the committee for hearing our plea, bring Jane home, so that she can actually talk to us about all of this stuff. So this is very exciting. You've heard some of the basic outline of her career and what she's done here at UMass, and I guess I just want to provide a couple of other glimpses into what it means to have all those different titles, for instance. How we aren't really used to those joint appointments here at UMass, so what does that mean exactly? Well, I think for Jane, it's really a fitting marker of the range of her influence and of her knowledge and expertise. So on the academic side and the political science side of her life, she's a distinguished scholar on organization theory. She's also well known in the public policy research community. She's a highly esteemed advisor to policymakers near and far, as Provost Staros just mentioned. She is an expert. She's one of the experts on, maybe the expert, on how new information and communications technologies are really changing what government can do and how people can actually be part of their government and democracies. If you've ever had a 5-minute conversation with her, even, you know that she's a very creative and insightful observer of what all these technologies might mean to all of us over time. So she's really, in my view, the model of an engaged scholar. And so that split appointment probably does reflect something, maybe a little like a certain kind of split brain. We know that, we have a left side of the brain and a right side of the brain. And we're told that to be a truly creative person, somehow or other you have to get them to talk to each other sort of more efficiently. So that, you know, there's all these exercises you can do to improve your creativity. I think people like Jane have the same kind of thing, the same kind of split brain, but it's a little bit different. It's, you know, it's partly it's the theory and practice split maybe, or the academic and the public split, the desire to kind of have a foot in both worlds. Certainly there's a fast-moving world and a slow-moving university that also is a kind of split for people who are as engaged outside of the academy as Jane is. But it's really important to have people like that here, because to be able to keep up our knowledge, to keep up with what's happening in the world, to have our students be able to actually learn what they need to learn to go out and do the things in the world that we want them to do, we have to have people who are engaged, who do form that kind of bridge like Jane does. So let me just say too that Jane is an amazingly hard worker in ways that are not always obvious. So the Provost mentioned the fact that she was brought here to lead the Science, Technology, and Society initiative. And in a sense, I guess in a certain way, that's a little bit like applying her knowledge of organizational behavior and theory to something that's very local. And that sounds a little abstract and kind of like what we always do in academia, but it's actually really not. It's actually a really big deal to take on a role like that. To sort of, again, make herself almost literally the bridge between the hard sciences and the social sciences. To be a partner on grants, to go out and find the social scientists who can make those kinds of connections. It's actually a lot of work to do, and Jane has done it incredibly well. Just as a couple of examples, she had been part of with the Center for Hierarchical Manufacturing. She was the director of the Societal Implications of Nanotechnology. She organized conferences. She continues to bring in scholars from around the world on some of those issues. She's the co-PI of CATE, the Commonwealth Alliance for Information Technology Education. And she, by the way, she knows what all these acronyms are. I have to read them. A program that's designed to try to increase the representation of women and minorities in information technology and communications fields. She has helped give birth to many other projects on campus, large and small, that are really too numerous to mention. But I'll just say what's really amazing is that she reaches out and she pulls scholars in from around the campus, from around the world, to come together and to learn from each other, and fortunately also to be able to learn from her. So that kind of cultivation and institution building is really not a very visible side of what Jane has done, but it is a really, really important side. And so to the extent that sometimes that is a thankless side, I just want to personally say thank you. I think we all owe you a debt of gratitude for helping to build that here on campus, because that is the kind of campus that we want and need. Now on the more glamorous side of things, the Provost has mentioned the World Economic Forum. That, of course, is the big conference that happens in Davos, Switzerland, that draws in CEOs and heads of state and leaders of large international NGOs, and Jane Fountain. The stories from Davos are kind of fun. She did not get to fly there in a helicopter like many of those, or arrive in her own private plane like many of those folks, but it does sound very exciting to be here. Maybe she'll share a couple stories with us. So she was there, hobnobbing with those heads of state and working with people for several years, and then she became the chair of the Global Agenda Council on the Future of Government. So she has been there as part of the big conversations about where we're headed in the future, pulling together research, pulling together the people who are going to be implementing whatever these changes are that they'll be coming up with, briefing leaders of countries. She's been involved in many different kinds of ways. And yet, of course, she has not forgotten that she still lives here in Massachusetts, being on the Governor's Innovation Council, which is also an opportunity to both share her knowledge, but also to learn from the other people on that commission, and to bring that back to campus to think about how governments can more efficiently use information technologies and to make our lives better as citizens in Massachusetts. And she still manages somehow or other to keep up a very active research agenda, which Brian will talk a little bit more about. But let me just say that one of the things that the Provost didn't mention, I hope it's okay for me to mention this, is that she has recently been elected fellow of the National Academy of Public Administration, which is probably the highest academic honor in the public administration and public policy field that one can get. So overall, I'm very pleased that we're all here to hear from this very important, engaged scholar. What I find inspiring about her work is that she's applying theory, but she's also taking advantage of her curiosity about the world and her ability to communicate her research, to go out there and interact with people and bring things back that then inform her research, which I think is the virtuous cycle of someone with Jane's interests and skills. So at this point, I'm going to turn things over to my colleague Brian Schaffner, who is the chair of the Political Science Department, who'll kind of maybe talk about that other side of the brain or whatever it might be.
My left foot. Thank you.
So thank you, and again, it's my honor to get even just a third of an introduction for Jane. And I figured that by the time I got up here, that many of her great accomplishments would have been already taken care of. So what I thought I would do is talk a little bit about what Jane has brought intellectually to the study of the intersection of technology and governance, where she really is one of the world's experts in this area. And Professor Jane's stature within the discipline was first solidified with her transformative book, Building the Virtual State. Building the Virtual State is a path-breaking piece of scholarship that came at an important historical moment. At the turn of the century, scholars and policymakers alike were struggling to understand why major innovations in technology, particularly the advent of the internet, had not revolutionized government in the way that many predicted it would. The internet was supposed to make government agencies more open and dynamic places where innovative ideas and policy solutions could easily flow into and within organizations in a way never before possible. Yet at the start of the millennium, this promise seemed largely unrealized, and many were struggling to understand why this was the case. In her book, Professor Fountain took a step back from the IT enthusiasts and instead took a much more careful and methodical approach to thinking about how government organizations would integrate technology. In doing so, Jane drew from a wide array of theories, from political science, policy, and organizational research to build a framework for understanding the problem. Her book lays out the reality that institutional actors generally attempt to use new technologies not to change how their institutions operate, but to solidify those operations. In other words, technology alone will generally not alter how institutions operate. Instead, her technology enactment framework predicted that the effect of technology on institutions is contingent on the existing bureaucratic structure and the behavior of key actors within the government organization. The book had and continues to have a major impact in both academic and policy worlds. It's been cited well over 1,000 times. It was awarded an outstanding academic title by choice, and it's been translated into 4 different languages. But it was really just the beginning of Jane's transformative work in this area. Professor Fountain next went on to found the National Center for Digital Government, which was mentioned earlier, a center she continues to direct today. The center was established with support from the National Science Foundation to develop research and infrastructure for the emerging field of information technology and governance. Her research through this center has built a deeper understanding of how social, technical, and policy research can better integrate scientific understanding with information technologies used in government. As technology has transformed, so has her research. In Professor Fountain's work, the oft-cited Web 2.0 has become Government 2.0, where public agencies use blogs, wikis, RSS feeds, Facebook, and other social media to communicate with citizens and to share information. And although these have been touted as breakthroughs in government communication, Professor Fountain questions how transformative these technologies have been in practice. In fact, the incremental pace by which institutions change and the real or perceived barriers to substantial changes or challenges developed or expected as a result of the introduction of technology has been a recurring focus in her research. Increasingly, Jane's research is also transnational, as we've heard a little bit about already. Through her Science, Technology, and Society initiative, Jane has served as principal investigator on the National Ethics in Science and Engineering online resource beta site project and the International Dimensions of Ethics in Science and Engineering project. These projects examine how ethics have been integrated into research and education, especially in light of an increasingly global scientific environment. The research developed in conjunction with faculty from political science, public health, education, computer science, electrical and computer engineering, and physics has resulted in frameworks through which the scientific community may better understand and incorporate ethics into social, physical, engineering, and policy sciences. Jane's research has had a major impact on the discipline by almost any measure. Her research has been cited thousands of times by other academics. She has been a PI or co-PI on nearly $9 million worth of NSF awards, and if you include grants on which she has participated as senior personnel, her total increases to well above $20 million, not that anyone's counting. She has also won a litany of professional awards and honors, only some of which you've heard about in our introductions, but her research has also had a lasting impact on the political and policy world, as government actors frequently use Professor Fountain's research and advice as they consider their own technological integrations. Professor Fountain has had the kind of career that we all wish for ourselves. Her work has made a substantial impact on the discipline, several disciplines in fact. But perhaps more importantly, it has also had a major impact beyond academia. It is truly the case that when Jane speaks, policymakers everywhere listen, and so should we. So, without further ado, it's my great pleasure to introduce Jane Fountain.
I'm deeply honored to be here. Chancellor, Provost, Mike Malone, other distinguished guests. I want to thank the selection committee for choosing me. It's a great honor. I want to thank you, Lee, for putting forward the nomination, the work that goes into that. I really appreciate it. I see students, colleagues, department chairs, and others who are just so supportive and create a terrific environment for research, for teaching, for outreach. So without further ado, let's get to the talk. I'm afraid now that anything I say will be a complete letdown, but I'll let you be the judge. So here's the outline, and I can't make that bigger. In the videos, there's a huge screen back here, which doesn't exist anymore. So I sort of thought with that in mind, if anybody needs to move up, talk about some of the big questions and particularly the big claims. And the period under study here will be about really 1992, 93 to about the present. Go through some definitions for those of you who are not social scientists, because this is a particular area with particular streams of research. My niche, which in preparing this talk, in spite of all the nice things people have said, I realize is very arcane and very boring. But I'll try not to bore you too much with it. Take you through 3 administrations that have been, if you like administrative structures, quite interesting, and then get to other democracies and dictatorships, and then finish. So we are not very good at predicting technological futures. These are just some quotes from people who know a tremendous amount about computing and who actually have a great interest in its transcendent qualities. But yet you had people like Bill Gates, the famous 640 kilobytes should be enough for anybody. And that's 1981, guys. This is not 1870 or 1930. Thomas Watson, the great chairman of IBM, I think there's a world market for maybe 5 computers. And then Bob Metcalfe, a brilliant guy who was founder of 3Com in 1995. We're in the Clinton administration, who says, basically in that long quote, I think the internet is going to have a supernova-like spectacular growth, and then in 1996 it will catastrophically collapse. So part of the reason for showing these as a kind of warm-up song is that even into the 90s, you have people saying the internet is a fad. And in places like universities, outside of media studies, outside of computer science and information science and communications, you had many people saying this is a fad. So I spent years of being on panels at professional associations where anyone who had the word technology in the title of their paper would be lumped into a panel, and it would always be a Saturday afternoon, the very last session of the conference, with these wildly disparate papers. So through part of much of the 90s, the Social and Behavioral Science Division of NSF funds, at least in political science, maybe sociology is different, really nothing on IT and government, and had no intention of doing so. So early funding for this comes out of the Computing Directorate, SIZE, Computing Information Systems and Engineering. And then the hype for people saying that the internet would change everything further kind of obfuscates the field. So Nick Negroponte at MIT, hyperlinks subvert hierarchy. The fact that we have a World Wide Web with hyperlinked information means hierarchies are just going to collapse. We'll have flat organizations, people are empowered, everybody will be making all sorts of decisions. The net will wear away institutions that have forgot how to sound human. I don't even know what the last phrase means, but sounds kind of good. My personal favorite, in case you can't read the red, from John Perry Barlow, had an association with the Grateful Dead, then launched the Electronic Frontier Foundation. Again, mid-90s, guys. It's not long ago. We are in the middle of the most transforming technological event since the capture of fire. I used to think that it was just the biggest thing since Gutenberg, but now I think you have to go back further. So how do you think about, the adoption of the capture of fire and what that means for organizations? And then one more, Jeff Jarvis, who does a buzz machine, big hype guy. And this is quite recent. If we become too obsessed with privacy, we could lose opportunities to make connections in this age of links. So don't worry about privacy. For at least the past 10 years, people have been saying privacy is dead, get over it. If you care about democracies, if you care about governments, it's a little bit harder to make sweeping statements like that. Okay, so now I'm going to take you through the kind of spinach part of the talk. For some of you, it's familiar. For some of you, it's not, but it's ground I think we have to cover. So the information revolution. I have wonderful colleagues in STS who kept telling me for years and years, Jane, it's not a revolution, it's not a revolution. Look at the Industrial Revolution, it was not a revolution. It doesn't happen like World War II, where it happens over 50-year, 70-year cycles. Calling it a revolution, emphasizing disjunctures is just not correct. Information and communication technologies not only affect communication, but they're so powerful because they affect capacity, production, they affect coordination, and they affect control. These have lots of implications for governments. They have lots of implications for the state. Their effects interact fundamentally with systems and processes in institutions at the human level all the way up to the legal level. What's the state? We mean something. We don't just mean the state of Massachusetts or even the United States, but in political science and political sociology, we have an area of theory called the theory of the state. How autonomous are states as actors on the world stage? What can we say about state structures and state behavior? The relationships that states structure and influence with civil society and between civil society actors. These are all areas of interest for people who study the state as an entity. Theda Skocpol, who was here just last week, is one of the foremost contemporary scholars in this area. States affect political and social processes through their policies and their patterned relationships with social groups. I'm just going to give you hints of these areas so that we get the lay of the land down. Another quite important area, both for understanding the state, but also government organizations in general, is Max Weber, who quite famously in 1922 wrote an essay on bureaucracy in his magnum opus, Economy and Society, where he lays out the characteristics of bureaucracies, which become not only the organizational and institutional characteristics of organizations called bureaucracies, but of this thing we call the bureaucratic state. So it turns out that whether you are an authoritarian country or you are a democratic country, many of the elements of bureaucracy in your state look very much alike. So this gives us a way to traverse across dictatorships and democracies. What's important here? Jurisdiction. Contrast this with monarchies, with strong, not today's monarchies, if there are any left, but the king and the patrons of the king who can do whatever they want. So Max Weber says jurisdiction, clear scope of authority, hierarchy, superiors and subordinates. There is a command and control structure. This not only gives people rights and authority, but it delimits their rights and authority. Rules and procedures, you don't just make things up as you go along. You don't just do whatever you want because you're the king and you woke up and you decide to be benevolent one day and dictatorial another day. But that things need to be standardized, that those rules would be codified into procedures, that there would be people called bureaucrats who would understand and would take those procedures seriously. Why am I telling you about this? I'm telling you about it because many people said the internet and web, new ICTs will wash away bureaucracies. We need to get rid of bureaucracies. Bureaucracies are terrible, and bureaucracies are what are prohibiting and inhibiting innovations from the internet, web, and then more recently social media. Well, you should ask yourself the question whether you want those characteristics to go away. Most of the time when we say bureaucracy, we mean red tape, or we mean things not working right, or excessive layers, excessive forms, excessive rules. But that's not what the Berian definition is. And institutions, the easiest, I have a feeling, Charis, can you not read anything in red?
I can kind of make it out.
Kind of make it out. Okay, good. So this is from Douglas North's wonderful book, Nobel Prize winning economics, writes a book on institutions because, in part, the World Bank and other international organizations throw all sorts of money at developing countries, trying to get them to change, trying to get them to grow economically. And we finally have the institutional turn in which we say, you know, if they really don't have good institutions in place, nothing's going to happen. It doesn't matter where they are technologically. It doesn't matter whether you're boosting entrepreneurs. You need to have strong and healthy institutions. So what are these institutions? They're the rules of the game. Simplest definition here. In a society, they are humanly devised constraint. They have wide shared social agreement. They shape interaction. They shape choice. They don't determine choice and decision making, but they shape it. They are the constraint space within most of us work in our various communities. And North says the past can only be made intelligible as a story of institutional evolution. Cognitive scientists, and more recently computational scientists, and we need a tip of the hat here to our new computational social science group, which I'm part of if I can ever get to their meetings. But there's a long lineage here. Abelson and Shank's work on scripts, plans, goals, and understanding emphasizes the rule-based nature of cognition, building up to organizations, building up to societies. Interpretivists in sociology and communications emphasize more the interpretive part of this and the shared meaning part of it and the social construction of these things. But once in place, they tend to be highly stable. So now lots of boxes and arrows. You heard a little about the technology enactment framework. There were many claims about technology's influence on structures, economic structures, organizational structures, political structures. It seemed, and it still seems, that there's far less attention about the ways that structures influence technology, influence design, adoption, and particularly uses of information and communication technologies. This is a full, I can't believe that even in 2001, this clunky graphic appeared in the book. We didn't do anything snazzier. But the point is that we can look at the objective elements of technologies, but we need to separate that from what Wanda Orlikowski and others call technology in use. How are people actually using things? Because they may be using their systems in very different ways than they were ever intended, and usually there are very partial uses of these systems. And what's mediating that? Well, an important area of mediation are organizational forms, both the bureaucratic forms that I just talked about, and then newer, arguably newer network forms. And underneath these, there are these larger, more macro institutional arrangements. A Japanese colleague and National Center for Digital Government Fellow, Hirokazu Okumura, said, Jane, you left out all the actors. You have the structures and the technologies, so he added actors. We won't talk all the way through that, and Alexander Shellong, another wonderful National Center for Digital Government Fellow, said, you know, we left out citizens, so what about the rise of citizen engagement? And then a wonderful NCDG fellow who's now a faculty member at CDE said, you know, you could really quantify this, so I'm going to do a partial least squares model, and let's measure whether institutional factors really do make a difference. And he's just published this book that he started in about 2004, where he really did look into actually subnational systems, measuring all sorts of things. I won't take you, obviously, through this, but both the characteristics of websites and portals, as well as institutional, demographic, political, and economic characteristics. It's a very interesting model that I don't even presume to understand because I haven't done partial least squares for a long time. Moving along from that, that was basically building the virtual state kind of stuff, and a few years after. You'll notice in the early model that bureaucracies and networks are not really broken out, but if you actually look at actors, they're working at different levels. Most of us are part of teams and working groups, that bottom level. And there is a lot of shared meaning, interpretation, institutions working at the micro level. At a mid or meso level, people have been interested in procedures and systems, in routines. And so for organizations, the cohesion is not just around people, but around the systems, the performance programs, that people use and draw on and build on every day. And then at the higher level, we have legal structures, regulatory structures working at a macro level. Neo-institutionalists were interested for a while in connections between macro, meso, and micro levels. Structuration theorists wondered how it is that new ideas built up in teams and working groups come to be codified, why some catch on and some don't, why some get instantiated in organizational processes that will then stick and live on beyond those people, and why some don't. So in order to do that, we have to break organizational settings apart into these levels. This will be sort of too much, and we want to get to the interesting stuff. In terms of practice, because I am interested in practice, and it's very useful to talk with managers and teach aspiring public managers who say, how am I going to do this if I want to be collaborative or I want to be innovative? How do I do it? One of the things we found when interagency performance was successful is that at each of these levels, certain things were in place, and we can talk about it later if someone wants to, but you can break out those levels. And then a third area, a newer area, for me at least, is examining and writing about temporal dimensions of digitally mediated institutions. And there are a number of theoretical streams that have explored these dimensions, so it's very easy to build on the work of people like Paul Pearson, Theda Scotchbull, Fernand Brodel, Skoranek, Kathleen Thalen, and others, but also to pull in Singh Grul's new work on conventions and focal points, which again, we won't go into. So let's talk about presidencies and how they've tried to come to terms with the internet in their administrations in order to get things done. And so here's the Clinton-Gore administration, and you can see how long ago that was, in a sort of happier, lighter time. And the president and vice president can put on their little shorts and go jogging. As you all know, Al Gore invented the internet. So of course he was particularly interested in using it. They launched something called reinventing government. Building a government that works better and costs less was the slogan. They put the invention group right in the White House because they don't really know where else to put it. Toffler and his wife are there. Others, West Coast futurists are there. John Kamensky, Elaine Kamarck, a whole group of people, some still in government or working around government, are there. And they're coming up with ideas for how the internet will transform government. One of the important ones, at least for me, was something called virtual agencies. They decided not to try to move organizational boxes around, something presidents often do to their peril when they launch reforms, because you simply invite resistance and you waste 4 years trying to get people to get along. But they thought that with the internet, you could take information from different agencies and make that available. So the basic idea was, if you're a student and information you need about student loans or other programs lies across different federal agencies, why should you need to know where those agencies are and where that information is? Why don't we just build a website, build a portal, like these customer portals, so that you can get the information you need? We won't ask agencies to change anything at a deep level. We'll just ask them to co-locate their information. They did this for seniors. They did this for business, specifically small business, for environmental affairs, wilderness, for rulemaking, for trade data. In fact, there's an article within NAFTA that said throughout North America, Canada, US, Mexico, all of the trade data definitions and standards have to be harmonized. That's how we're going to build a trading bloc. So in order to do that, people would actually have to get together, talk to each other, make agreements on all of those things. This is one part of reinventing government, but it was a big change. I know this is too small, but part of institutional analysis is to go through changes in legislation. That's the top level. And what you see here are a couple of things. The Government Paperwork Elimination Act in 1998 is very effective at eliminating paper, because it just says by a certain time, you will get rid of paper in these processes. That forced all sorts of things to happen, like electronic signatures. I've been filling out travel reimbursements. Where's my? And electronic signatures can help make things go much faster. And there are other things that you can do if you say, we are going to eliminate paper. Of course they don't. They probably use more paper. But it's a sea change. The E-Government Act, that little blur in red, doesn't come along until later, but that's the one that really says, we have an office for e-government. We have people who are responsible for e-government. The other are acquisition for IT, but Klinger-Cohen and the Government Performance and Results Act are important not just for e-government, but because they move agencies toward focusing on performance. Some people don't like this. They say it's neoliberal. It privileges efficiency, effectiveness, productivity beyond democracy and equity. There is an argument, a quite valid argument to be made, but it was also a bit refreshing to say to organizations, the agencies, you really should have a plan. You really should have a strategic plan. You really should have a set of goals that you could let the president know about, and we really should be able to measure those goals. And then Klinger-Cohen says, and you know all those computers and systems you want to buy, the millions and millions, billions of dollars, really you should connect those to your strategic plan, because that would be a really good idea, that they would help you achieve your goals, not that you want to buy them because you think you have to have them. And in something the size of the US federal government, this is a huge amount of money, and these are huge organizations to try to move. So what did we find? And you heard in the wonderful introduction about building the virtual state, we found hyperlinks did not subvert hierarchy, certainly not in the short run. Agencies sought to gain power through their use of technology by building their budgets, by building their staffs. They didn't say, gosh, we could cut a third of our workforce. We could get rid of all sorts of civil servants, not at all. The incentives, furthermore, structurally, the incentives were quite perverse. OMB, which evaluates agency budgets, I know this is deep inside administrations, but it's important to some of us. OMB had no way to evaluate a cross-agency or virtual agency budget. So you had these projects that ended up being kind of out in the informal system. There was no way to plug them in. Congressional subcommittees evaluate and oversee agencies and the programs in agencies. You have very clear, this is that Weberian bureaucracy, very, very clear what the roles are, who speaks to whom and when, and these collectivities just couldn't be assessed, they couldn't get resources, they couldn't get budgets, they couldn't be plugged in to the operating structures of the government. And by the end of the Clinton-Gore administration, everybody sort of knew this, they could recognize it. We didn't know going into the Bush administration, and this is another sort of hearkening back to the zeitgeist, we really didn't know whether the Bush administration would embrace e-government, whether they would care about the internet and government, whether we thought, well, maybe because Clinton Gore made it such a centerpiece, the Bush administration would sort of trash it. Of course, they would use computers, but we thought maybe it won't be an important part of what they do. There was, though, a transition team that moved forward these cross-agency initiatives. There had been quite a bit of development from 1993 forward, and what happens in the Bush administration is a kind of systematization, a formalization, and a much more rigorous treatment in many ways of these projects. As you might expect from a Republican administration, they put in place a CIO, the nation's first CIO. They set up an office for IT and e-government in OMB. We were, I think, probably the first country to have one. The US is way out in front of other countries at this point. If you went to Europe, as I did at this time, they were saying, we don't want our culture to change. We don't want to use all of these devices. And when they did think about using technology, it was mostly for public engagement, public consultation, public deliberation. The history is quite different, at least in the stark conditions. Portfolio management, lots of organizations. One thing to note here is that the internet doesn't disintermediate at this point. It intermediates. We build more layers, we build more roles, we build more organization in the government. Something that should be mentioned, we're now at 2001, 2002. Many firms are doing amazing data mining of personal and public information. They're combining it in ways we never thought possible to tell you things about your preferences and interests that you don't even know that you have. Remarkable computation going on. The government is prohibited from doing a lot of that, at least on the personal side of information. What it ends up doing, particularly after 9/11 and because of the Patriot Act, is to start buying the information from private firms. Government agencies couldn't collect it themselves, but through contracting and other arm's length arrangements, they could get the information through public-private partnerships. And so we start to subvert the surveillance of government on its own people. I don't want to well, in some ways you can't overstate it, but for this particular stream, I don't want to overstate it. So the Patriot Act is there, and it's very much in the background of building e-government. The Bush administration takes those virtual agencies, takes that idea and expands it into 24, 25 cross-agency projects. Now I'm going to go much more quickly, and introduces an idea from business that we should have an enterprise approach in the government. So what you see, what you don't see, are the column heads, which are all the federal agencies. And then on the left-hand side, a transition group said, look, let's take a list of basic business functions in the government: disaster management, loans. We have many agencies that make loans, grants. Most of us know about grants.gov. It gets a start here. It's one of several projects. Travel planning, training, vital records, records management, these sort of generic things that every agency does. All of them had bought their own systems. We have this cacophony of systems. Many times, agencies, I did some work with the US Information Agency. One office said, they bought this system. I don't care what you recommend, but we have to buy something different because we can't be perceived as copying that other office. So we have to make sure our systems will never speak to each other. So you have this cacophony. And this is enactment at work. It's partly political, it's partly human nature. There are lots of social elements to it. But this is the first time you have people in the White House, in OMB, saying, you know, we need to look across the whole government. And it's in part because they had reached the limit of what you could do on this agency by agency, or these sort of pick-up virtual agencies. So here's grants. These are all the agencies that make grant awards. He said, how many grant systems do we really need? Let's get it down. I think we're down to two or three. And then you have analyses like, let's drive down, this is cost per grant of mandatory and discretionary for one slice here, fiscal 06, 07, and then projecting outward as you built up the volume in this system. So you got things like grants.gov. This is their recent website. Here's benefits. If you're a citizen and you want to know what benefits are available to you, you should be able to find them in one place. We're not going to go behind these very nice home pages. Regulations, e-rulemaking is another important area. Many, many agencies do it. Wouldn't it be nice if you as a citizen could see all of the proposed regulations where public comment was being asked for? Now I'm going to go much faster. So there's a much more business-like approach. What did we find? We found that the institutions were starting to change to develop cross-agency work, that there was still no real theory or model of jurisdiction in networks. We still don't have one, nor do we have accountability in networks fully worked out, nor do we have many other things that are essential to bureaucratic states worked out for network structures. Files are increasingly digital, so they could be shared, they could be moved. There are lots of things you could do. And more the rules, the administrative rules are in code, in computer code, right? And a lot of the code is coming in from outside contractors. So those rules are going further from the expertise and the knowledge of civil servants. So President Obama will whiz through this. This is kind of a time warp because of where we are in the election, but this is 2008. Social media becomes possible, right? YouTube becomes possible. User-generated content. These were obviously not produced by the Democratic National Committee or by the campaign. This is political expression of individuals. I won't have these moving. Obama Girl can sing. The dance-off, you know, Obama, they're probably still up on YouTube. And then the Yes We Can mashup. This was a big moment. The Obama campaign, the Howard Dean started this, but Obama was the first one to really build social media into the campaign. For reasons of time, we'll whiz through. Email directed, how many of you get many emails a day? That was new. We used to think it was cool. Now it's a nuisance. Friends, nobody cares about MySpace. Twitter was new, 126,000. These micro donations have changed along with super PACs, but this is a big, big change. The My Barack Obama website, this was, again, 2008. You could go in there, you could sign up, you could make your own little sub-site and become part of the community. Lots and lots of social networking. This was important as an adjunct to television advertising in order to spread the message further and further. We should ask ourselves how much interaction was here, how much information is coming in versus going out. Expansive use of YouTube. I updated figures, and it's remarkable how those numbers have gone up, but we won't do it here. And something that was quite important, we hear a lot about the ground game. These web tools were not just there to get the message out and to socially network, but to identify, those of you who know our census data and our mapping, we can go right down to the household level with our maps. So through data mining, essentially, you can go right down to the household level and then deploy those nice volunteers who sign up to go where they're going to get the most likely people to vote. You don't want them knocking on doors of people you already know are going to vote or are already active. So this is a coupling of tremendous intelligence with the kind of zeitgeist of we can use social media. This is management. This is not just online communities on Facebook. It goes much, much deeper than that. You would have thought that by now, I certainly would have thought that by this election, the Republicans would have this up and running, at least as well as the Obama campaign. This is a recent Pew report from June. The blue is the Obama campaign. The green is the Romney. It's not my data, it's Pew data. Much more activity from the Obama campaign. You might argue, well, they're trying to reach people who are online. and then the social response. And the takeaway here is that messages go out, and people may be interacting in their own communities, but those messages are not really coming back all the way up the line. So it's mostly broadcasting or narrowcasting. Open government. First executive order is, in the Obama administration, unprecedented levels of openness, transparency, participation, collaboration. They build something that's been quite important, data.gov. People don't have laptops, we could have fact-checking and twittering in real time. An order goes to the federal agencies. All the public data that you can put in a form that can be put online should be put online and made available to people in ways that they can use, which means geocoded files, Excel files, et cetera. Get our apps up, get APIs going so that people can start using this data. The idea here is to bring the intelligence outside of government into the government to solve problems. Apps.gov does something similar, and there are lots more. You've probably heard of competitions online, blogs, soliciting of ideas, and a building of communities in civil society with the government to try to be better at solving problems. Something else happens. This is a kind of nerdy, but I think it's really quite important. So we've now gone from about 1992 to, where are we, 2012. We had the Government Performance and Results Act in '93. Just this past spring, the Government Performance and Results Modernization Act, GPRAMA, was passed. And what's quite important about that, I think, is a focus on interagency and government-wide coordination and collaboration. So for the first time, Congress gets in the game. They were really laggards. And they are now, so we now have executive congressional games of a kind that political scientists know. They are now mandating the executive to do more interagency and government-wide activity. For reasons that are similar to our focus in SBS on interdisciplinarity, that big policy challenges like food safety, homeland security, health, sustainability lie across policy domains, they lie across agencies. We can't address them without interagency, cross-agency efforts. The established chief operating officers, so we keep. This is, I think, a key codification of this idea of doing things across agencies. We still haven't rewritten Weber, but practice is moving in a more horizontal direction without losing agency structures. When do I have to stop? Really? Okay. All right, well, we could be here for another 2 hours. So let me try to go faster. The GAO, the General Accountability Office, gets in the game as well. It has to do a report to Congress every year on how to improve, how to cut costs in the government. Another thing, not as important as the Patriot Act in 9/11, was of course the financial crash. So much of what's going on in government is not the 1990s zeitgeist when we had a surplus. It's, my gosh, how can we save money? They identify, they make 70 proposals for streamlining. In 2011, they find another. These are streamlining across agencies, across programs. When I saw these early this spring, they looked remarkably to me like those initial cross-agency projects I showed you that came out of the Clinton administration. And when I brought this up we had an event at the American Society for Public Administration where a lot of groups will be involved in giving advice to the next administration and writing papers to that end. Many of the staffers are young. They don't even remember those efforts, but there's tremendous knowledge that has been accumulated by the people who are involved in those projects, and a lot of lessons learned, a lot of good practice as well as what not to do that hasn't been brought forward. One of the things that I observed from going across administrations is obviously each one wants to put its stamp on things. Everything has to be renamed. We can't call things by the same name. Bureaucrats know what everything is, but other people think things are new until you start looking into it. And there's a lot of, unfortunately, information loss, except in the senior civil servants. So the fewer long-term experienced civil servants you have, the more loss you would have from administration to administration. The executive is also required to develop cross-agency priority goals. So this is very interesting because the executive was already sort of doing this, but now Congress has ordered them to do it, which is not a bad thing. And it's Senator Coburn who is one of the leaders of this effort. So these are the Obama exports is at the top. You probably heard him talking about exports, entrepreneurship, and small business. You actually see a lot of coherence between what you're hearing on the campaign trail and what have been the priorities for the past 4 years with pretty deep efforts. There have already been hearings, and there will be legislation to create new agencies that will bring together many of the programs that are involved in exports and small business. The one in red there is cybersecurity. The government finally gets to the point where they realize that we're like a sieve in the federal government, and we really can't build anymore without figuring out cybersecurity, not just for foreign policy, but just for plain basic vanilla domestic policy. So here's the export.gov site, which is an important site. So wrapping up this part of the discussion, when social media broke, Facebook, et cetera, there was intense attention, Gov 2.0, Web 2.0, that this again was transformative, that people power why would you even need government when you have Facebook, and people could be making their own videos and like making their own government online. Just absurd. Part of what I like about the World Economic Forum stuff is you actually hear people who are paid quite a bit of money and have quite important positions spouting this stuff. And it gets translated into programs in their countries and in their corporations. If you look at the Obama administration, not the policies that come out in other politics, but the way that the administrative structures are growing, every agency now has all of the icons, Facebook, Twitter, et cetera, and will have social media channels. But I think the more important work in open government has been in these longer-term institutional developments of being able to work across agencies and to identify policy areas that lie across agencies. So there's been a refocusing. Of course, I come at this with a particular lens on these types of initiatives. Legislation, conclusions from this, legislation lags social behavior and innovations, protections, privacy and security greatly lag the behaviors of institutions, organizations. States are building amazing surveillance capacity. Citizens have tools. It's not clear what the balance will be, and one shouldn't try to answer that in a simple way. If transformation has been taking place, and I think it has, it is really through the accumulation of many small changes than a big disjunctive shock or change. And note, in society, inequalities are growing, so the internet has not led to vast social changes. And the broad general conclusions that people would generally draw are probably going to be wrong. Other countries, just quickly, here's the Open Government Partnership homepage. 46 countries have signed on. This is an effort to make the open government movement global, which it already is. It's really taken off. We don't know how serious these commitments are. You have to look at what countries are actually doing, right? Not the commitment that they sign. The UK, which never presumed that people had a right to government information. It's a very different history from ours. Passed, in the past year or so, their first right to information laws, which has been historic for them, and other countries are following. Again, you have to look at how these laws are actually enacted and monitored, and whether they have any teeth in them. Open questions, why Julian Assange is visiting us, is how open should governments be? Should everything be open? We had a great session. This is not an inside Davos story, a future of government session in which we brought together, Clay Shirky was there, and Jonathan Zittrain was there, and techno enthusiasts were there, and then we had people from countries, ministers of finance, economics, who were saying, you know, we often negotiate with countries as a neutral third party. If those deliberations were ever made public, we couldn't do the work that we do. People brought up so many occasions where you would not want these very provisional and sensitive discussions to be open. And it really wasn't something that the Assanges of the world had ever thought about. So this is not a promotion of Assange. Another area that's important for open data, and you can see here many countries, there are many, many more than that now, is the ability for government to become more transparent, to build accountability. If you can see the budgets for government, for agencies, if you can see plans, if you can see transcripts, et cetera, and it's easy to see them because you can just click and there they are, you've changed transparency and accountability, or one would hope that you have, simply by doing that. Many developing countries are starting to use tracking systems to try to expose, name and shame, bring sunlight onto corruption, because corruption is a huge drain on many, many countries. Here's the I Paid a Bribe website. This was actually financed by the Omidyar Foundation, the founder of eBay. This is in India. So it's a place where people can post anonymously. What it's supposed to do is protect the anonymity of people who post, to say, you know, my child, we needed to pay a bribe for them to get into the school, or we needed to pay a bribe to this traffic officer who says that we parked somewhere where we weren't supposed to, but it's false. We needed to pay a bribe to get a license. In many, many countries, the necessity to pay small bribes to get anything done. So this is not looking at large-scale corruption, but just the small, everyday corruption that eats away at governments. This kind of site, at least 17 countries and NGOs have asked for their code so that they could put up similar sites. We'll click over the Scottish Parliament online, the Morsi meter, which is Mohammed Morsi is being held to account. But when you look at what he's being held to account for, this is in Egypt. Security is certainly important, but if you actually looked at the list of things, it would be, are you going to pay the police overtime when they have to work over? It's like the mayor of Cairo kind of things. Traffic, cleanliness, bread, very, you know, are the bakeries going to have to stay open to bake enough bread? Very nuts and bolts things. Not, you know, will Iran be our friend? Will the US be our friend? Big geopolitical. The sphere here for participation is quite narrow. Ushahidi, another area for user-generated content. This is David Kobia. This is something that was developed in several countries of Africa, Malawi, South Africa, Ghana, as well as the US, to allow people with a cell phone to use SMS messaging to send information that would then be posted on a map. The first use was to report and then map voting rights abuses in Sudan. That's on the left. And what this does, it certainly didn't get rid of voting rights abuses, but it starts to bring these things out into the open. People can remain anonymous. It's very easy to put up this platform. After the earthquake in Haiti a few years ago, it was part of a rapid response so that people could report problems, and you could do a quick assessment. Here's similar use for wildlife tracking. Our own Charlie Schweik is doing this for invasive species, and after the oil spill in the Gulf, we built something here. NOAA didn't quite know how they wanted to use it, but we have the technological capacity to do this kind of rapid support reporting, use crowdsourcing, use SMS text messaging to map things and then develop a response. What we don't know how to do, these are logos of NGOs and firms that try to work together to respond to the earthquake. What we don't know how to do very well is tie this to institutional processes. So in Geneva a few years ago, heads of international crisis management and disaster relief organizations got together, and they were very frustrated because they have routines, they have procedures, they have a way of working, and they don't know how to use this information. You could say, well, look at the map. You can see where the problems are. Go and respond. But of course, it's not that easy. There was also a problem of setting up expectations. This is not really a high-level organizational problem, but people thought when they texted, you know, I'm here and we're out of water, speaking of water, that there would be a response. But of course, this doesn't say anything about what a response will be. It just allows you to report problems. So it's taking a few years, and of course we will work it out, but it's very interesting that the innovations are far out ahead of the institutional capacity to use them. A little bit about dictatorships. This is work by Martha Fuentes Bautista in the communications department. She's done a great study of Hugo Chavez, who, as you know, was just elected again. Now here the claim is the internet will spread democracy all over the world because it's open, and by some magical process of openness, countries will become more democratic. Instead, what we see is that dictatorships are becoming quite savvy about using social media, using the internet to reinforce their dictatorship. So Chavez in 2010 says the revolution must appropriate the technology. Chavez Twitters. Chavez has a whole army of Twitterers. He trains people on the use of social media to keep the revolution alive. And so it's being done under state control. The 50-cent party, as it's called in China, I wish you could read this because it's written in such wonderful official communist language. This is a quote from their guide. These are people who are paid to go online to say positive things about the Chinese government and the party, no matter what happens, to push back against insurgents and people who would use social media and the net to talk about corruption or other things. So the working guide for internet commentators aims at cultivating the professional and cooperative skills of the internet commentators. General rule: network consensus warfare. I love it, so Chinese. When you hear this stuff from communist countries, it's great. Network consensus warfare, controlling online information, is of vital importance to the survival of the People's Republic of China's state regime. You bet it is. And they are giving people little micro payments to tweet and to use social media on behalf of the Communist Party. So what you're seeing here is that these are institutions. They have norms, they have rules, they have routines as well. And you're seeing the embeddedness of these technologies and social media in a very different kind of politics. Yevgeny Morozov, whose work is quite sardonic and mordant, calls this idea that the internet and social media will lead to democracy iPod liberalism. Says the KGB used to torture people. Now they can get all this data online. He has a very big critique. So wrapping up, what do we see from this? I actually took out lots of other examples. Institutions are critical. They are the rules of the game. The internet and social media and their uses are limited without effective institutions to amplify them and to ground them in the structures of